Thank you very much, Martin. It really is humbling. It's a great privilege for me to be here in Armagh and to know that you have sacrificed the sun that is beginning to peep through the clouds in order to hear me talk about the dark clouds of the border. I really appreciate that, and all the effort that has gone into the organisation of the Hewitt Summer School. I know it's an enormous voluntary effort and takes a lot of organisation and scheduling, and I'd like to pay tribute to all of those who have kept this summer school show on the road. It's a great achievement, and thank you all for being a part of that. I'm going to take off my jacket. Now that Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, I might get hot under the collar just to be safe. There are an awful lot of questions that we are asking at the moment. I won't for a moment pretend that I have all of the answers to those difficult questions, but I do think it's imperative that if we are going to debate these questions, discuss them, and try and work a way through this particular problem, we do need to have an awareness of the long and tortured history of this border question. I think that's absolutely crucial, and I'm only trying to make some kind of a contribution to that. An awful lot of people since the Brexit referendum 3 years ago have been trying to make sense of the Irish border question, including those from outside of Ireland. Those foreign journalists in particular, I've been talking to many of them, particularly over the last year or so, who are trying to educate themselves on why the backstop has proved to be such an intractable issue, why there is such a febrile atmosphere around Westminster, almost a toxicity, a meltdown within the political establishment, which is partly, it seems, about the backstop, but the wider questions there of English nationalism and the withdrawal agreement and the relationship with Europe. Just where does this Irish question fit in to that wider framework and those wider complications? When this book came out earlier this year, I spoke to a Danish journalist who was writing a story on the backstop and the withdrawal agreement. And having noted that I was born in Ireland in 1972, he asked me what it was like to be a child of the Troubles. I was bemused by this question, given that I grew up in a housing estate in the suburbs of South County Dublin, and whatever about me being a troubled child, I was certainly not a child of the Troubles in the sense that he was suggesting. And I emphasised to him the importance of being aware of where the trouble and the violence had been concentrated over the course of the Troubles, but also being aware of how Ireland had become so divided. He did then go on to talk about the idea. He said, "I understand that all Ulster Protestants see themselves as British," to which I responded, "Would that it were so simple." It's not that simple. And it's a reminder, and this is not in any way to denigrate that journalist, it's a reminder of the difficulty of trying to explain these complex questions of identity and territory and the evolution of the border question. It's a very, very difficult job to try and explain that to someone who isn't familiar with it. At least this journalist was attempting to try and provide some kind of historical education. And even thinking about the different sentiments and feelings that were engendered by the border in my lifetime. My parents, of course, would have been well aware of the enormity of things that were happening the year I was born in 1972. Indeed, Bloody Sunday and the reaction to it has been referred to by Eamon McCann as the high point of 32 county nationalism in the 20th century as a result of this idea of a cross-border empathy with the enormity of the tragedy and what it represented. But there were many low points too. Cahir Healy, who was a Sinn Féin MP for Fermanagh and Tyrone, asserted in 1925, when it was clear that there would be no change to the border, that Northern nationalists had been sold into political servitude for all time. And there was a starkness and a bleakness about that assessment and about that fate. There's also, despite the political advantages, the inbuilt majority that the Unionists have in what becomes the new state of Northern Ireland after 1920, there's also a feeling of betrayal on the part of many Unionists. We do have to think of those who are left on the wrong side of a border, be it the substantial one-third nationalist minority, or those who are left on the other side of the border as Protestants and Unionists in Donegal, in Cavan, in Monaghan. There was that sense of betrayal And we need to be conscious of the idea of those who find themselves on the wrong side. But also the betrayal or the distrust that is often articulated on the part of unionists. One of the reasons why they seem to have such a siege mentality at various stages is because whatever about the settlements that they get in 1920, they don't necessarily trust London, and they certainly don't trust Dublin. And you can see how a lot of these themes and these sentiments endure throughout the decades and still resonate today. So we do need to be aware of what lies behind that complex psychology. And the border, of course, is not a technical trade issue. You here know that. When you consider the weight of history that is attached to it, it's not just a technical trade issue. It's about culture. It's about disrupted lives. It's about sociology. Its sheer meandering complexity means that we have to give due consideration to all of those themes. It is about territory, yes. It's also about dashed dreams. And it's about pragmatic compromises. So we need, of course, to think about the border in that deep way. And if you want to drill down into that deep history, of course, it'll take you right back to the 16th and the 17th centuries. The vast project of social engineering in particular that saw in the region of 6,000 square miles of plantation and what that meant for the province of Ulster. And that idea of the impact that it had on the region. And John Hewitt, of course, is very interested in that idea of Ulster as a region and regionalism. So, of course, you have to go much, much further back. I am not going to do that today because I want to concentrate on the existence of the border over the last 100 years and what it has represented. But I am aware, of course, that you do need that much wider backdrop. And you need to be aware of how Northern identity or Ulster identity has been characterised by various people. You mentioned the great A.T.Q. Stewart there when writing about Ulster as the narrow ground. And this summer, 50 years ago, how many of these issues of identity were brought aggressively into the frame. Another historian, Oliver MacDonagh, wrote about Ulster and what it meant to Northern Protestants. And he said for them it was more than a province, less than a state. It constituted at least a people. And again, when it comes to questions of identity and how that impacts on the perception of the border, you do need to be aware of different definitions of Ulster identity on both sides of the border. But what becomes apparent too when you're looking at what was going on exactly 100 years ago, as plans were being put in place for the creation of the border, for what became the Government of Ireland Act, which was the idea of legislating for two parliaments, one for a new Northern Ireland, one for Southern Ireland. What became apparent is that there had been agreement about the importance of exclusion, of partition. Some of the debates that had gone on in the previous 5 years had been about whether this should be 4 counties or 6 counties or 9 counties. Other debates that went on privately had been about how you might carve out this border. Would it be decided on the basis of local government units? Would it be decided on the basis of parliamentary constituencies? Or would it be decided on the basis of the original county lines, which, as Martin had mentioned, had been designed in the 17th century? And think of all that had built up around them in subsequent centuries. So there were different projects or ideas being looked at in relation to how you might design this new border. But eventually it was settled that it would be on the basis of the counties and the 6 counties. That gave James Craig, who was in the ascendant at this stage and soon to become the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, that gave him something that he could manage to his political satisfaction. It gave him his 2/3 unionist majority. Part of the thinking may also have been, who the hell wants troublesome Donegal? James Craig certainly didn't want troublesome Donegal, the outer edge of Ulster and all the complications that came with that, even though, of course, parts of Donegal were considered vital for the Ulster economy. So some of these discussions are going on privately, and we also know that there was a worry, and it was articulated by Edward Carson, who went on to become the iconic father figure of Ulster Unionism, even though he was a Dubliner, even though he saw himself initially as an Irish Unionist. For tactical reasons, the focus becomes on Ulster. You can't save an all-island unionism in the sense that you can't campaign to keep the whole of Ireland connected to the British Empire. So they do become pragmatic. And there's a feeling of betrayal on the part of Southern Unionists. But Carson also felt betrayed by the British government. The idea that Ireland and the Ulster question were merely pawns in what was a distinctly English power game. What did the British government want 100 years ago? It wanted the Irish question off its table. How would it get the Irish question off its table? By coming up with a solution that was based on the division of Ireland. Was it inevitable? Perhaps. Because if you consider what the alternative to the division of Ireland was 100 years ago, it probably was civil war. And there was a fear, of course, about that, not just in Ireland, but in Britain as well. But that didn't mean that Unionists necessarily trusted what the British government was up to. If you consider, for example, the logic of the Government of Ireland Act almost 100 years ago, according to Philip Kerr, who was one of the advisors to David Lloyd George, it would solve two problems. It would take Ulster out of the Irish question, and it would take the Irish question out of English party controversies. And that's how he described it in private. It wasn't that David Lloyd George had particular ideological leanings when it came to the settlement of the Ulster or the Ireland question. But there was also a logic at work when the drafting of the Government of Ireland Bill was in train 100 years ago. And it was this logic that it would enable Ireland to work out its own salvation. That a Council of Ireland would ultimately facilitate the coming together of the two parts of Ireland. That this would be temporary. And that was something that was articulated, along with the idea that Ulster Unionists, as a result of this settlement, and these are the words of Philip Kerr, would not be on the same footing as British citizens. Northern Ireland was being treated differently, because the set of circumstances in Northern Ireland were different. They were unique, therefore Northern Ireland needed a particular settlement. And again, you can see how that particular assertion might resonate over the decades. But there's also, of course, the annoyance that this new Northern Ireland might be an expensive nuisance. The British Exchequer is responsible for 80% of the revenue of the new Northern Ireland in the early 1920s. There were also the practical difficulties surrounding what was a ridiculous border in the physical sense when you consider what was involved in it. The county lines that I mentioned that had been designed in the 16th and 17th century, the colonial high-handedness that resulted in this crude carving and brutal carving of the border and all that it cut through. The First Ordnance Survey for Northern Ireland in 1938 identified a very dense rural road network and pointed out that there were 180 crossings when it came to the border in Ireland, but only 16 of these were approved roads or approved crossings. There was also an awful lot of publicity given to a house in Fermanagh in 1937. The house itself was divided by the border, and it was often used for propaganda reasons, but also to demonstrate what many regarded as the farce of the Irish border when it came to it cutting through farms and this individual house. The reason it achieved a lot of publicity in 1937 was because the Catholic Registration Association wanted 4 Protestants taken off the electoral register on the grounds that they may have slept in the Irish Free State and they ate their meals in Northern Ireland. Such was the layout of the house and the border. Now there was, of course, an attempt to try and undo this partition. James Craig had asserted that it was a supreme sacrifice for Unionists to accept this partition of Ireland, words which must have rang very, very hollow for Unionists in the South in particular. But what about the sacrifice that was made by nationalists? What about the mandate that Sinn Féin had arising out of the electoral success in December 1918? When it came to the end of the War of Independence and the negotiation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, of course, the Sinn Féin negotiators wanted to try and undo partition. Isn't it revealing, too, that David Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, was determined that those negotiations would not break down on the Ulster question because he found that that was the most difficult part of the settlement to defend. It was easier to defend the idea of Ireland staying in the Empire than to defend the partition of Ireland, which privately many senior British political establishment figures did not believe was a good idea at all, not just for political reasons, but also for trade reasons. As David Lloyd George put it when he was writing to James Craig, you have cut off the natural circuits of commercial activity. And there were, of course, to be economic consequences. But in relation to the politics of trying to undo partition during the treaty negotiations, we get an awful lot of information from the diaries of Tom Jones, who was the secretary to David Lloyd George as Prime Minister. And Jones recorded some of the private conversations that went on. David Lloyd George asserting that Ulster Unionists were a pugnacious people. We are only behind them to the extent that we cannot allow civil war to take place at our door. We would like nothing better than that Ireland would be united. On this question, we stand neutral. But how was Arthur Griffith going to translate these private admissions into a practical solution to the partition problem? What he wanted, of course, was the idea of plebiscites, that individuals would be able to have a vote on whether they wanted to remain in Northern Ireland, or the idea that you could reduce Northern Ireland to such a small size that it would no longer be economically or politically feasible. Now, eventually what is settled on, of course, is the Boundary Commission proposal, which is something very different. That there would be a review of the border at some future stage in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants insofar as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions. What the hell did that mean? It was deliberately vague, and the Irish negotiators were sold a pup. What Arthur Griffith suggested was that this would ultimately deliver the kind of plebiscites he had in mind. Of course, it was not going to deliver anything of the sort, but it was about trying to get over a political hump or a barrier during the wider negotiations and to get that question out of the way. But there were other very interesting and revealing admissions from, again, senior Conservative figures, including Lord Salisbury, who suggested that the average English voter had little interest in and even less understanding of the Irish question. How that resonates down through the decades. And we do need to consider those private admissions and those expressions of frustrations. There were also those who believed, including Andrew Bonar Law, our senior Conservative Party, that the Irish were an inferior race. He had come to that conclusion on the basis of their implacable opposition to each other within Ireland. But he was no great admirer, too, of the Ulster Unionists. We recognise their case, he said, in spite of their bigotry. And there was that sting in the tail. So there was that attempt then to try and take that question out of British politics. And Austin Chamberlain, I think, summed it up most succinctly. We have to prevent the Irish question being a fatal influence on British politics. And he made that assertion in 1924. And what happens then, of course, with the settling down of the treaty settlement, the civil war, of course, which has caused the terrible violence that attends the birth of the state of Northern Ireland and indeed the birth of the Irish Free State. And then a real entrenchment. The border becomes entrenched. In the spring of 1923, there are new customs posts and charges being imposed by the Irish Free State government. There is a hope still that the Boundary Commission might deliver. Kevin O'Sheil, who was the legal advisor to the Free State government and who was a native of Armagh, referred to a policy of peaceful do-nothingness during the Civil War. There was nothing the Free State could do about the border during the Civil War. And James Craig, of course, was determined to use the violence in Northern Ireland to further entrench the position of Unionists and to create the kind of state that he wanted, a state that was in an almost permanent sense of state of emergency. O'Sheil referred to that peaceful do-nothingness, but he did suggest once the Civil War was over that there was now an opportunity in relation to the border question for the Irish Free State to engage in international propaganda. That we can, he said, influence world opinion. Isn't the delusion marvellous? that the rest of the world could be persuaded about the plight of those affected by the Irish border. The rest of the world was not interested in the Irish border. But there is a lot of focus on this idea of propaganda, that there was a moral case to be made internationally, that the mutilation of Ireland, in the words of nationalists, was simply unacceptable, given everything that Ireland had offered to Western civilization over the centuries. And many of the memoranda are infused with this. But there's always also serious research being done by the Northeastern Boundary Bureau, as it became known, in preparation for the impending Boundary Commission. And of course, when it came to the Boundary Commission, the hopes of the Free State were dashed. Justice Feetham, the South African judge who was chair of the Boundary Commission, was determined that Northern Ireland would be recognised as the same provincial entity at the end of the Boundary Commission proceedings as it had been at the beginning of the Boundary Commission proceedings. He wasn't contemplating any kind of wholesale transfer of territory or a new Northern Ireland in the sense that was understood or hoped for on the part of nationalists. And there were deliberate leaks in relation to the proceedings of the Boundary Commission and eventually the report of the Boundary Commission itself, that there would only be a transfer of 31,000 people in the direction of the south, but 7,500 people in the other direction, including parts of East Donegal. James Craig was adamant that the Irish Free State had been living in a fool's paradise in believing that the Boundary Commission would deliver for them. And the report was suppressed in 1925. Such was the embarrassment it caused to the Irish Free State government, and Craig was triumphant. And some historians have argued that after that, many in the South did not look over the border again until this summer, 50 years ago, 1969. And there is a degree of truth in that, but it's by no means the full story. There is an ambivalence in the Irish Free State, in the sense that there's a denial of the legitimacy and the reality of Northern Ireland, reference to it as the 6 counties, don't give it the recognition as a legitimate state. But there's also an acknowledgement of it, because it can be useful when you are banging the anti-partition drum, whether it's for electoral reasons or for propaganda reasons. It could be useful and it could come into play in relation to that. There were exceptions to the rule, including Ernest Blythe. And Ernest Blythe had a particular view on consent, and indeed used the word consent in 1928 in relation to trying to persuade Unionists about the merits of the reunification of Ireland. And let's not pull any punches in relation to those who were actually quite pleased at the partition of Ireland, even though they were nationalists. Consider the economist George O'Brien, for example, who felt that the disease of sectarianism was a northern disease that was now safely confined in the new Northern Ireland. The irony there, as if sectarianism was not an issue in the South, in the Free State. There were those that got frustrated. Even when De Valera came to power, De Valera's logic had always been that the border had been imposed by Britain and could only be undone by Britain. There wasn't much intellectual depth to his thinking about a possible solution. This infuriated his colleague Sean McEntee, a Belfast Catholic, who wrote him a thunderous letter in 1938 denouncing the laziness of Fianna Fáil when it came to banging the anti-partition drum. We are subordinating prejudice to reason. We've got to consider what's involved in the approach that you have taken to the border. You are relying on Britain's big stick, and it will fail. There were others who believed that if Britain could be persuaded to declare itself in favour of unity or not standing in the way of unity, that then the Irish problem could be sorted out between Irish men, as it was put at the time, and there was a degree of naivety around that. British figures did speak out of both sides of their mouth, however, when it came to the border. Consider Warren Fisher, for example, of the British Treasury, who asserted privately that it was an artificial and absurd boundary, and it was stupid and ludicrous, and if I could get rid of it in the morning, I would. But there was no chance that he was going to say that publicly. And this is what you get in the archives. You get the frustration of diplomats and senior government ministers from the Free State, then the Republic, who are travelling to London, who are getting these private admissions, but they're not getting any kind of public declarations for very obvious political reasons. But there were also those within the House of Commons, including Herbert Morrison, when he was Deputy Prime Minister in the early 1950s, who insisted that he was tensely irritated with those who were referred to as the six-county Tories. And he said, once again, that it ought not to be a deciding factor in British politics. Get it away from us was the logic there. And then there was the perspective of Frank Aiken, who held the position of Minister for External Affairs for a very lengthy period. A native, of course, of County Armagh. Somebody who had been a very senior figure during the War of Independence with the IRA. And what interested me about his musings on the border was the moralism inherent in his reasoning. He was obsessed almost with the moral superiority of the Irish nationalist case against the border. And he did encourage people like Joseph Brennan, who was the Irish representative in Washington, to keep on that particular path of moralism, that Ireland had been a co-founder of Western civilization, as Brennan put it in the 1950s, had kept the soul of Ireland alive in the difficult 1920s. But what John Hearn, who went on to represent Ireland in Washington, also recognised was that there was much indifference in the United States when it came to the Irish border, even amongst Irish immigrants. You couldn't assume that it would be a dominant feature at all within American politics. And then there were those who posed challenging questions in the 1950s, including Senator Owen Sheehy Skeffington, a very independent-minded senator, who, when it came to the question of the border and a debate about partition and a debate about whether Northern nationalists should have the right to be heard and represented in the Dáil, he said, what sacrifices are we prepared to make in this republic when we talk of unity? What are we going to do about pay, about social services, about housing, about the National Health Service? What have we got to offer? There were no answers to those questions in the 1950s. And when you consider the plight of Northern nationalists who came looking for assistance, Eddie McAteer, for example, in the 1950s, who insisted that the Dáil needed to hear Northern nationalists, he found that the door was slammed shut. You are determined, he said, that no reproachful voices from the north will disturb your tranquility. It was the sting in that particular accusation. Now, there were, of course, changes, particularly with the arrival of Sean Lemass as Taoiseach in 1959. Much more of a focus on economic affairs, on the preparation of Ireland for eventual EEC membership. The Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement was an interesting case there, that Sean Lemass got very directly involved in negotiation to break down the trade barriers between Britain and Ireland. What is not widely known, of course, is that the provisions of the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement came into operation between North and South of Ireland before they did for the whole of the United Kingdom, on the grounds that that was an imperative and was an urgency. But Lemass was also wary of there being too much focus on the plight of a downtrodden nationalist minority who were living in a rotten state, who were dealing with discrimination and worse. How revealing is it that when Ryerk went to Derry to film a programme in the 1960s about gerrymandering, about poverty, about discrimination, that it wasn't broadcast on RTE because of the delicacy of the political situation, the attempt to get a thaw in North-South relations. That Ryerk programme on Derry was not broadcast on RTE until 1989. And there was a very obvious reason for that. There was a reluctance to engage with the reality of what was happening over the border. And there were writers too who voiced concerns not just about the politics of this, but about the morality of it. As Tyrone Guthrie put it, the moral failure to achieve human cooperation. Or as Hubert Butler, the great essayist, wrote, the importance of dialogue across the border, which he attempted to organise and facilitate, try and take the politics out of it, focus on humans, focus on ideas, focus on dialogue, a difficult thing to do, of course, in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it became even more difficult, of course, due to the outbreak of the Troubles 50 years ago this summer. And we do get a degree of confusion and panic and bewilderment in Dublin in relation to what this represents. these themes of violence and the containment of violence that dominate many of the government proceedings in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. The famous speech of Lynch, that we will not stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse. What did that mean? Was that deliberately ambiguous and open to different interpretations? It is obvious what it would have meant for those who were in the thick of that terrible violence in the summer of 1969. This was presumably about troops moving over the border. This was about direct intervention. And T.K. Whittaker, who was advising Jack Lynch, was urging him to take the heat out of the situation. And he said in relation to unity, we can't afford a bill of £100 million a year, as it was then, that was the subvention, nor can we take on the terrifying task of keeping sectarian mobs at bay. That was the logic and the advice that he was getting at that stage. And there was a concomitant concern about violence spilling over the border. Whatever about those moments of cross-border empathy that I referred to earlier on. Whatever about the degree of emotion, and I wouldn't underestimate it, and the sincerity behind it. In the region of 11,000 people were displaced and came over the border. Many of them were housed in huts up to the early 1970s. They were formerly referred to as refugees from strife-torn Northern Ireland. But how long did they remain in the Southern Irish consciousness? When does fear take over? When does disgust take over? The SDLP certainly was very active in ensuring that there was dialogue between itself and Dublin governments. But they also identified this fear that trouble might spill over the border as being a bigger priority, as they saw it, for the governments in the Republic. And Jack Lynch often felt very conflicted about this. If you consider, for example, an exchange he had with the British ambassador, John Peck, in the early 1970s, Peck said to him, what would you do if you were handed Northern Ireland on a plate in the morning? Jack Lynch responded, I would faint. And he probably would have fainted. And it's an indication that there was no simple solution or answer to this question of unification. Both the British and the Irish governments, for their own particular reasons, wanted to see Stormont survive the Troubles in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. Now this, of course, was not just about the high politics. It was not just about the crisis that engulfed Northern Ireland 50 years ago. There was also the continuance, of course, of cross-border smuggling. And inevitably, the border made smuggling very attractive, both on a large scale and on a localised and personal level. It's estimated that in the late 1970s, in the region of 5,000 pigs were crossing the border illegally every week. Sometimes they made several journeys, those particular pigs. I was intrigued to find out that you could fit 30 bottles of whiskey in the carcass of a cow. I certainly didn't know that before that. And there's also then the silences that were experienced by a lot of those who do travel over the border and settle in the Republic. Susan McKay has written very powerfully about that. She went to study in Trinity in the 1970s, and she said that there was a strange silence. And there was a sense amongst her and her exiled peers from Northern Ireland that many in the Republic were oblivious to what was going on there. There were others who sought to take advantage of two different regimes, including the great Frank Crummy, a senior activist in the Irish Family Planning Association in the 1970s, who was stopped in Balbriggan on his way back from his trip over the border with 40,000 condoms in his car. And the guard who stopped him asked what was going on, what was his cargo, and he told him that they were all for his own personal use and that he could not interfere with him in any way. The Irish Women's Liberation Movement, of course, famously and symbolically also made a trip over the border, though they were somewhat naive, of course, about the liberality or supposed liberality of the regime in Northern Ireland, and many of them ended up throwing aspirin when they came back to Connolly Station in 1971. So there were some of those symbolic gestures or defiances. And there were also those, of course, who continued to be affected as border people. And they are a distinct people because of the particular circumstances of the border and what it meant for them. Dark MacDonald has written very powerfully about Clones and Monaghan and what it meant to be in a particular region where his childhood, as he writes, was circumscribed by rings of steel. You know, and the whole question of access and approved routes and unapproved routes, that was hugely inconvenient for both nationalists and unionists when it came to the practicalities of trying to travel around the border region and trying to get from one place to another. And people sometimes did take the law into their own hands. But the archives, the British Irish archives, are very much dominated by a preoccupation, of course, with the violence. The idea that the border is a haven for gunmen, as was frequently asserted by British prime ministers, and a defensive southern Irish government which is insisting that it is doing all it can to try and contain it. But how do you police a border on that scale? It's meandering complexity that I refer to, the porous nature of the border. How can you come up with an effective security or military solution to that? You cannot. And of course, the hinterland there did facilitate those who were intent on their own particular campaigns. There were 468 people killed in Armagh during the Troubles. And there is, of course, inevitably a great infrastructure around them and great delays and great uncertainties, as well as evidence of great collusion. You know, and the border was sometimes brought into consciousness in the South as a result of some terrible tragedies, including the Miami Showband massacre in 1975. So there are all of those aspects, of course, to the border. There were many attempts in the early 1980s to try and get Britain to think seriously about the border question and about the wider question of the Northern Irish state. The late historian Ronan Fanning, who taught me Anglo-Irish relations when I began in UCD some 30 years ago now, referred often to the perennial difficulty of trying to command British attention. This notion that England loomed much larger in the Irish consciousness than Ireland did in the English consciousness. And there's certainly a lot of truth in that. Charles Haughey was adamant when he came to power in late 1979 that the border was an economic, social and geographic nonsense. But was it a political nonsense, was the question in the 1980s. Could he do business with Margaret Thatcher? Thatcher could be almost childlike in her private reflections on the border, whatever about what she was saying publicly. We have accounts from her senior civil servants like David Goodall or Charles Powell about her musings in Chequers after a few glasses of whiskey. Why can't all the nationalists just move south, was one of the questions that she asked. She also wanted to know, why can't we have a straight line border? Why have we got a border with all these kinks and wiggles? I couldn't resist that as the title of one of the chapters, the kinks and wiggles of the Irish border. It's almost childlike when you consider. And then when the Anglo-Irish Agreement was eventually signed and the breakthrough in 1985 and the intense unionist opposition to that idea of Dublin having a say, there was a very revealing private exchange and moment between Margaret Thatcher and Garret Fitzgerald, who was Taoiseach. They toasted the Anglo-Irish Agreement with a glass of champagne, and Garret Fitzgerald then raised gently the idea of seeking funds from the international fund that was envisaged under the agreement to provide funding for the beleaguered communities in Northern Ireland. And what was Thatcher's response? More money for those people, she said, waving her hand in the general direction of Northern Ireland. Look at their roads. Look at their houses. I need that money for my people. So where lies the precious union in relation to that? Where lies the real sentiment of the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain when it comes to those kind of exchanges? There were other more realistic exchanges, particularly between senior diplomats. Noel Dorr, for example, from the Anglo-Irish section in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Willie Whitelaw, who had been the first Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. They had a private meeting in 1987 at which the view was expressed that if power sharing could be revived, if power sharing could be achieved, that the importance of the border would fade over 50 years. So there was a sense that perhaps if there was a political breakthrough, that the border question might be allowed to take, or the border question, the heat might be allowed to be taken out of it somewhat. But you also then had those who became interested in the border in relation to what it represented. What it represented for those who were seeking to move around it. Colin Tobin's book, Walking the Border, based on his travels in 1986, was one of the best examples of that, trying to get from Castlederg in Tyrone to Derry. And he asks someone with a knowledge of the hinterland how we should go there. And he's told, well, you go into the south and then you go into the north and then into the south, back into the north again, back into the south and in the north. And eventually Tobin said to him, how will I know whether I'm in the north or the south? And his response was, you won't know. And he offered a gruff sort of smile. But Tobin also referred to how the border had taken its toll and the troubles around it. What he identified as the watchfulness, the fear, the distrust, people being unsure of their ground, particularly if they were coming to the border region for the first time. And of course, writers were very captured by that hinterland and what it represented and some of the fears and apprehensions it engendered. Consider Eugene McCabe, for example, in his Death and Nightingales, Father Leo McManus, who refers to hungry views and sour land making the best people in the world sullen and dangerous, a very evocative line. Now, there was, of course, huge progress made in the 1990s. I'm not going to labour the point about the toll that the Troubles exacted, and I'm not going to drill down into all of the detail of the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. I think what's significant about it in the context of the border is the extent to which it attempted to try and break both sides free from the inherited structures or the inherited mindset of those settlements in the early 1920s, to break them out of that structural trap, if you like, of the early 1920s. And of course there was a confrontation with the territorial claim on Northern Ireland in the Irish Constitution, but also a sense that perhaps Irish citizenship could be something that could transcend the border, and that people could come to their own decisions about citizenship and make their own choices, and that there would now be a degree of self-determination. And it would be based on consent, any future change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. It certainly is an Anglo-Irish thaw, but it's also a North-South thaw. 10 years ago, Peter Robinson, as First Minister in Northern Ireland, referred to North-South relations as having never been better. Seems like a long, long time ago now. And there was that sense of people coming to terms with a new dispensation. When you consider even that humour was allowed to breathe about the border in the early noughties, a pop-up border interpretive centre set up, for example, by the comedian John Byrne. And he talked about comparing the border with sex. That parents were embarrassed to discuss it with their children. You know, these were children who were growing up without any sense of a border and all the positivity around that. Kevin McAleer, the comedian, referring to the Irish border or the border in Ireland as the best little border in the world because it had far outlasted the Berlin Wall. And there was a marvellous moment, I think, in June 2016 when both the soccer teams of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland were playing in the European Championships. And the French sports newspaper referred to Ireland being united in atmosphere and the way they were supporting each other. And then the following day, the Brexit referendum and the tricky questions came tumbling fast. And I will, of course, finish on this. I think there's an appreciation, and there was an appreciation on the part of some members of the EU that the border was not just a technical trade issue, as I mentioned at the outset. But there was also the reality that the border was not discussed during the referendum campaign. And going back to some of these assertions that I made at the outset about 100 years ago and what the priorities were, there was an almost willful ignorance about Ireland and about the border question during that campaign. It's sometimes being dismissed as just an irrelevancy or a trifling matter, which we know, of course, it certainly is not. There was also the question of the DUP's stance and who it spoke for in relation to its support for Brexit and indeed its propping up of the Tory government. a government that is supposed to be rigorously impartial when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement, and they are the words that are used in relation to the honest brokers when it comes to the agreement. Theresa May had insisted before the referendum that it was inconceivable that there would be an invisible border if the Brexit referendum was passed, and yet afterwards she was insisting that there would be no return to the borders of the past. The mantra was, it will be a frictionless border. And we heard that an awful lot in subsequent years. There was a lot of debate about what the consequences might be for the possible unification of Ireland. Again, without much deep thought, I think, being given to that particular question. And it did generate fear, not just on the part of some unionists who, in the event of a united Ireland, might perhaps find themselves as a 20% minority, but also those who felt that this is something that could just further destabilise what was already a quite febrile situation. And whatever about a return to the borders of the past, there was a return to the ignorance of the past. Consider the assertions that Boris Johnson has made about the border and the dismissiveness, the contemptuous dismissiveness. The idea that this was akin to an invisible London boundary between Camden and Westminster, for example. There was that return to the ignorance of the past, or the continuity, you could argue, of the ignorance. And also a degree of slapstick, I think. I still have this image of Theresa May who went to North Down, 50 miles from the border, and looked indifferently at a cow. And even Dominic Raab and David Davis, when they were Brexit secretaries, who were not seen to be very proactive in engaging with the reality of the border, they eventually made these dashing visits. And the way the Irish journalist Justine McCarthy put it, they might as well have worn khaki shorts and binoculars. Such was the safari style of their mission. And it did remind me of Spike Milligan and his novel Puckoon, that was published in 1963, when the grim-faced boundary commissions are in the Duke of Wellington Hotel trying to decide on the last bit of partition, and the pubs are about to close in an hour, and they grab this red pencil and they all put their hands on it and they draw the line straight through the sleeping village of Puckoon. There was almost that sense of farce I detected in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. It would be funny, of course, if the stakes were not so high. And then you have, of course, the continued practicalities of how you deal with a border that is now reckoned to have 208 crossings by the most recent count, compared to the 180 that I referred to earlier on. I would finish by pointing out the importance of what Martin alluded to at the beginning, about how people conceive of the border now. There was a very powerful short film by Claire Dwyer Hogg last year, which was narrated by the actor Stephen Ray. And he referred to wounds that had healed and a gentleness in the mundanity of a border that's there but not there. We understand what that means and how important it is. It's a great pity that many more don't understand the significance of that. Hubert Butler had predicted back in the middle of the 1950s that in time the border might fade in importance, that it might become meaningless and drop off like a plaster from a wound that had healed, and survive as a definition which distinguished rather than divided. And in a sense, we had got close to that point as a result of all of the developments over the last 20 years. But Brexit, again, has hugely complicated and has hugely compromised that. But another very revealing poll is that 59% of Tories in Britain would rather see Northern Ireland leave the United Kingdom than abandon Brexit. And when it comes to the current political game of brinkmanship, and when it comes to the kind of assertions that are being made about the future of the United Kingdom and indeed the future of the EU, you have to wonder once again, where is that border going to lie? I referred earlier on to being born in 1972. A year later, there was a song written by Jerry Rafferty called Stuck in the Middle with You. And I can't help thinking of the lines of it when I think of the current Brexit debacle. Clowns to the left of us, jokers to the right. Here we are, stuck in the middle. Thank you.